This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidents are either the products of the imagination or used in a fictitious manner.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Purge Bucket. I'm here with my boy Harris, and today we're joined by a special guest.
Robert Larson, yes, special guest Robert Larson. I saw his art as a kid. It was always a treat going to his studio. And Rob, as when you were in art school, you found your way towards found art, which is more of, as I understand it, kind of a composition-based art. And what was your inspiration or process for getting into that? Why did you choose that path in art?
Hi, well, thanks for having me. Yeah, that happened really organically. Like you said, I was at art school up in Oakland, living in East Oakland, in a real industrial part of Oakland. And I was in a live-work studio there, the old Dutch Boy paint factory. And yeah, I was, just taking all kinds of courses, painting, drawing, sculpture, art history. And I just started taking walks along the railroad tracks that ran out behind the studio itself. And just sort of got pulled into that. The environment was so compelling and interesting. And there were so many materials and objects just littering the tracks. So
you kind of just started like picking them up, basically?
I did. I'd already been, exposed to assemblage art in general.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't completely foreign or strange for me to pick up these objects. I knew, hey, this is a worthwhile medium that can be used in art. And I just started picking them up and, carrying them as I continued to walk away from the studio. And then, sooner than later, my hands and my arms would just be full of these objects. And so I would just set them down in a pile there and continue walking and picking up and collecting. And then on my return to the studio, I would try to pick up these piles and carry as much as I could back into the studio and start arranging them. Like Harris said, it was very compositional. So it was finding relationships that these objects sort of suggested. They sort of draw you in and lead you because there's so much information that they contain as far as shapes and surfaces.
So you're kind of letting the art sort of build itself in a way, like where it's, the pieces are kind of finding each other to sort of form itself, or how does that work? Like how much of that is of what you make is based off of what's in your head versus what you find?
And I think, do you mean like, and as the process, like what you find kind of shapes where you put things?
Yes, definitely. And in those early days and years of working with found objects, I was really responding to the objects themselves and what I found. I didn't know what to expect. And so everything was really fresh and new. So that was actually really a sweet place to be because it was so much about discovery.
Yeah. When did you kind of crack the code that this was sort of going to be like your style that you would inhabit? Like you said, you're doing a lot of stuff in other mediums and things like that. And then you kind of have this moment where, you're going outside, you're finding all this stuff. Like, what does that feel like when you figure out, like, is there a moment? Is it a slow realization? What's that like when you kind of figure out, like, this is my lane?
I think it probably is both. The initial connection and interest, was immediate, probably on my first walk. So probably in the first 10, 20 minutes, I knew that this was really meaningful and important to me. And then in those preceding days and the weeks that followed, I knew it was something that I was going to pursue. I probably didn't know that it was going to be, you know, the central focus of my art for the next 30 years. But I felt I had discovered something that was that resonated with me emotionally, you know, psychologically, and conceptually. It had a lot of ingredients that came together.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, you know, you have all these traditional, and actually I think something that's important that we should go over is like what your art actually is for anybody who, you know, hasn't seen it. So you basically, you find objects in real life, and then you arrange them into sort of like abstract shapes on canvases. Or am I butchering how to describe your, you know, I don't know if you could put that on the plaque at the gallery, you know, on the little card or whatever. But yeah, if you could like describe your art for our audio listeners, what how would you describe it?
Well, I think I'll just start with the beginning and the first found object art that I made, because that's where this you know, conversation began. Those materials that I was collecting in the beginning were very more industrial, like lots of scrap metal that was, you know, had nice rusty patinas, along with distressed wood with peeling paint. In that area, there were a lot of like recycling junkyards, and a lot of the streets that dead ended into the railroad tracks were sort of these areas that, you know, maybe construction, remodel, under the cover, you know, construction workers and stuff would dump, you know, do illegal dumps. So it was those types of materials, and and so I was putting them together, you know, finding these relationships that were very kind of elemental, simple, compositional, you know, in terms of form, I would say. But they, in the beginning, they suggested often figurative elements, anything from nature, birds, flowers, figures, objects like a clock.
Yeah. I mean, so what I was getting when I was looking at your stuff is it's more about the, and just listening to you talk too, really, is it's kind of about the vibe that you're pulling in from these objects, and sort of what, you know, what it kind of creates in your mind, and sort of this like industrial sort of postmodern sort of, you know, garbage aesthetic mixed with like, you know, kind of machines.
Reclaimed.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, how would you describe your art like that? Like, are you trying to kind of, are there specific things like that you're trying to evoke, or is it sort of that vibe? Like, am I on the right track there with that?
You are entirely, and it gets back to the rich emotional.
Let me just say too, that's a smooth way to answer anyone, is you're on the right track entirely.
Agreed.
I think that's the showman in Rob, or the salesman, either one.
Yeah, you you know, no pun intended. All that work began along the railroad tracks. So I was literally on those tracks, and maybe that's continued and carried over in the language to speak about it. But there was sort of this dystopian, to some degree, sort of maybe not post-apocalyptic, but it was post-industrial.
Yeah.
And it was the late 80s, and it was a time of transition then. There was, you know, it was after many years, maybe decades, at least a decade of significant decline in manufacturing in that very industrial part of Oakland. So it was like a a living museum, perhaps even a dying museum, but there was a lot of
yeah, a dying
evidence.
museum. That's pretty cool. I really
Yeah.
like that. Yeah.
And the materials and the environment, of course, was so human made.
How has that changed over time then? Like you started off finding certain things. Is your style changing based on, you move somewhere else and you start finding new things, or you're looking for different things, or how does that style evolve over the years?
Well, it evolved pretty significantly with a discovery of a new material that was in the landscape that I hadn't taken notice of necessarily. And that was a discarded Marlboro package.
Oh.
And that introduced a lot of new ideas, information. So sort of departing from these more ambiguous, materials like the rusty metal and the distressed wood that sort of spoke of industry and, an era of manufacturing and decline. At that moment in the 80s, the discarded Marlboro pack all of a sudden made me think of Warhol. And I saw his Campbell's imagery, obviously kind of mirrored in the discarded Marlboro, and that just was a very interesting discovery that had so many layers of meaning and potential. And it was definitely part of the landscape. It, with its sort of blue collar, I mean, of course there's the Marlboro Man and the cowboy, but the smokers in that particular environment were, spoke to a lot of the blue collar workers that were, still trying to survive in this evolving economic landscape.
So how do you feel like your art fits into the art world? And do you have, how has your experience been in the art world? Do you have a certain opinion or take on that?
Yeah, well, I think probably the most interesting place to pick up on that is to sort of make the connection to, or to continue exploring the connection to Warhol and the Marlboro pack and Campbell's, and how it actually affected my approach to making the artwork, how my found object artwork evolved from there. And so at that point, now I've got this iconic branded item with all of the history that it contained of Marlboro Man, the history of tobacco, colonization, advertising, marketing, health.
It's a pretty loaded little box you found. There's a lot going on in there.
It is entirely loaded. And I think that's in part what led me to quickly work with it in a very abstract manner. Like I was trying to diffuse a ticking time bomb of content, of so much literal and topical content. And I felt that by working with them in a very abstract manner, which I'll describe a little bit, opened it up to truly allow it to be inclusive of all these different layers of meaning, because there's so many significant issues that just come to mind immediately and kind of can shut off the potential depth of what I was discovering with the materials in the landscape, that kind of context, that process, as well as I just sort of ruminated on the subject, an appreciation of its kind of grander, greater subject potential.
So you're saying that kind of the history of people in the art world and the history of the content you were picking up, you were kind of able to reflect on that and build from one another?
Yeah, well, I mean, at that point, I definitely made a transition from what might be like California assemblage, or not even California assemblage, but there's so many artists in the area that, from Bruce Conner and George Herms, that were influential, but found objects in general, with Robert Rauschenberg, and then going further back internationally, you know, a number of artists working with those types of materials. I took a big step into the realm of pop art, which opens up a whole other way of looking at expression. And so with the Marlboro Pack and my recognition of its association with pop art and Warhol specifically, I started exploring repetition and as a means to organize the visual information, and of course to process these things that I then begin to find in abundance. You know, the same object instead of the unique.
Yeah.
And then simultaneously, what was really compelling about it was that these, you know, machine-made items that once were identical and uniform, that most of us see them and interact with them in that state, once they were discarded, they were exposed to the elements.
Wow.
And time. So they're all weathering and changing, fading, distressing, not to mention, of course, just how they were squashed or crumpled. So they're changing in surface and 3 dimension. So that became a very, a theme in the work of this intersection of human-made, machine-made, very culturally loaded, and then being nature affected.
Wow.
And becoming organic to the point where some of them that I found were decaying and disintegrating into back to earth, essentially.
Wow.
Marlboro compost.
Yeah. And what's being housed in these things is a plant to begin with, right? So it's like a plant that's gone through this full industrial process, comes out the other end, and is discarded, decaying back into the earth. And that's when you find it. Wow. Yeah, that's crazy, dude. That's really cool.
Yeah, it really, it was rich and deep enough to hold my attention and to, keep the investigation going.
Dude, so what does that feel like, though, when you kind of figure that out? Like, I mean, this moment I'm kind of having right now myself in a kind of a, in our minute Zoom call where I'm kind of figuring it, I'm getting, I'm kind of getting it, or part of it. What is that like when you're, you haven't created the piece yet? It's before you've shown it and you're just it's like coming into your brain. Like, what does that feel like? Can you describe that feeling of like when you're kind of putting this together for the first time?
It, that there was, instantaneous, almost like an epiphany moments of, wow, this feels like it's significant. Mm-hmm. So there's a rush of acknowledgement of that. And then also as you work with the materials and the ideas and they develop and expand, I experienced that, wow, this is, turning into something even more meaningful than I had originally anticipated. Because at first, in truth, there was a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek kind of comedic element to it, like a parody, like, oh yeah, Warhol's Campbell's Soup, Marlboro, of course, instead of soup is good food and maternal and healthy. I mean, as much as a canned soup can be, it was sort of the evil twin of Campbell's. Wow. And it brought all those ideas of habit, of course, addiction, and mortality. and then sort of the knowing self-destruction, the recognition of what we're doing has ramifications and consequences. So that's of course personal and body oriented, but as symbol and metaphor, it just speaks to our times and the environment. And that was really just palpable and obvious to me, because I was finding these objects in a landscape that had evidence of pollution and decay and urban blight, not to mention disenfranchisement and poverty. So then it starts to add in all these other layers of social, cultural dimensions. They're all, of course, intertwined.
There's a lot going on there. There's a lot to think about. Yeah.
It was like discovering a reservoir. And that was, that really all speaks to kind of, topical content and symbolism and metaphor. But what really spurred it on and continued it was sort of the formal discoveries. Actually it was instigated probably in part by their campaign of Marlboro Miles, where you send in the UPC code, the barcode, and add up your 5 miles per pack until you could sort of redeem them for Marlboro gear. So smokers were tearing the pack by pulling one side of it off and tossing it to the ground, where it continued to sort of splay out and unfold. And at that point, I'm like 3 or 4 years into it before that campaign started. They were no longer really interesting as objects. I mean, they had lost that kind of, and to good effect, they lost that immediately recognizable Marlboro pack quality. It was like, it's kind of been, I don't know, not diminished, but perhaps at first glance for me, as I was working with them as full packs.
Yeah.
So that led me to then begin dissecting the package. And I first did a piece with box tops. So it was just a repetition of Marlboro, Marlboro, Marlboro. And my sort of draw to that was, let me see how much I can condense the number of packs into a smaller area to reflect the abundance of these packs that I was finding in the landscape.
Yeah.
I feel like I feel a bit like we're at your gallery now. Is this somewhat of what it's like to be at a gallery open where you're talking with people?
Definitely. I mean, that's the best part of whether it's a studio visit or a gallery opening, a reception, where you get to talk to people about it. And recently I've been sort of framing my artwork and sort of recognizing that's really about discussion. That's its strength, is that it fosters discussion on all these subjects that are distinct yet interrelated. And, people can relate to the medium on so many different levels. And that has been exciting for me to sort of respond to people who actually have positive experiences with smoking. Granted, they were all in their 20s, but they were like, this reminds me of, sitting around having discussions with my family as we all smoked and just sort of relaxed.
Wow.
Kicked back.
Well, I gotta ask, do you smoke, or did you smoke, or does that play part of it?
I didn't. I never smoked tobacco in the sense that it turned into a habit. I've smoked cigarettes, of course, for fun. But in part, maybe that also enabled me to relate to the subject, the material, in a more abstract manner. It wasn't too personal in that sense.
So there's some separation there.
I wasn't confronting my own specific addiction, but it became, obviously, I mean, it spoke metaphorically, symbolically to other addictions for me and people.
Yeah. Sorry guys, I'm getting this alert right now from Zoom that's like we're gonna run out of time in 8 minutes. So I've been trying to like sign up for the thing that allows us to keep going past that, because I mean this is going great and I kind of want to go longer, but
Yeah.
so sorry if it looks like I'm like
You know,
typing or
heads
whatever.
up.
Yeah, I'm trying to
I'm
like.
sorry for my little technical snafu on my end that kind of got me
It's all
off
good, dude.
off cue, off
We're all-
kilter a little bit.
We're all kind of battling decaying machine, right? So it's you know, I'm feeling a very post-industrial vibe today, getting started off the right way. Yeah,
So, oh yeah, if you want to try to see if you can expand
yeah,
that time.
let me try this real quick.
It's a good
Otherwise,
idea.
here's what we could do is I think I could end this meeting, stop this recording, and then send you guys a new invite link.
Okay.
And then we could jump back in and then just kind of paste the two together,
Okay.
if that works. Why don't we keep going for another 5 minutes on this one?
Okay.
And
Let's say too, now that we have a break, we have an opportunity to say at the end, Rob, you can plug whatever you want, and also stay on with us. We'll say goodbye and whatnot, but stay on with us because we do a little wrap up after.
Okay, very cool. And if you are interested, I mean, that's redundant, but if you wanted to go over any of the sort of questions and take another pass at any of it, I'm totally good with that. I mean, I'm expressing my own little bit of frustration because I felt like I was cluing in and connecting and forgetting that this is as formal as it is. It's being recorded.
yeah.
And then it was like, I stumbled, and then that stumble affected the flow, and then a follow-up. You guys had to come up with a follow-up question that might not have been the follow-up question you would have had I sort of completed the thought.
I think it's been going great, honestly. I mean,
Yeah.
Chris,
It's all about like so much information has gotten out.
Yeah.
And of course, what I'm responding to is all the information that I know that hasn't gotten out that could have been a.
So is there something that you'd like to touch on that we can?
Sure. And I don't know if this fits as a standalone thing, but it was in sort of the back to the beginning of when you asked, what was it like to discover that this was, how was it when you realized that this was something compelling or important?
Mm-hmm.
And there was an aspect, a quality to the collecting of the materials that I felt was really, that propelled it forward, was the fact that there were so many of these discarded items on the ground that I hadn't, obviously noticed before until I started picking them up and then purposefully looking for them and collecting them. And so every individual pack that I found as I was out scavenging on these walks, it just became another affirmation. Like, there is relevance to this. It's physically affirmed, it's tangible, and the quantity of it is a layer of the narrative as well.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of people smoking, and there's a lot of people littering, and this is part of, Marlboro American culture is a real thing, but this is a more tactile and obviously a very different angle to the Marlboro country that is sort of being portrayed by the advertisements. This felt like is Marlboro country too, and a much more interesting and dimensional Marlboro country, even though the iconography of Marlboro Man in the Wild West is captivating, but it's a fiction. To attach that with the cigarette specifically is a very contrived construction.
Mhm.
And so what I was witnessing was the reality of Marlboro country. And of course, there are many other realities. If you go into litigation and medicine and all of that.
Yeah, he's got a lot of jobs in a way.
Yeah,
The
he's a
Marlboro
busy
man.
man.
He's a busy man, dude. He's a busy man. I kind of wanted to ask, how does your work change how you see the normal world when you're just walking around, like in your day-to-day life? Like, you know, you're going to Starbucks or whatever. How does your art change? You know, are you looking at the ground
Is it
for trash all the time and stuff? Are you looking for objects to pick, or?
Yes. And when I was, the times that I'm really focused on the collecting of the materials and the scavenging, I would have to admit that my eyes did scan the ground probably more than most, looking for little things. And you sort of, you discover, where things will accumulate. So you sort of get a strategy, and then intuition comes into that, and it really felt like a hunter-gatherer kind of mentality. Obviously, on the gathering side of things, but you're hunting for them, and that was a really great sensation. It was so elemental,
Yeah.
and timeless and ancient. And after, I would devote days, weekends to this collecting process. So I would be out in the landscape for 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours during the summer.
Wow.
And spending a whole day with your eyes scanning the landscape and sort of just being led through the sort of labyrinth. There was no specific route. It was just like coming down a street and then going, hey, is that Marlboro Red that I see in the distance, or is that Coca-Cola Red or Budweiser Red?
Wow.
And you start to be able to distinguish between the two, at least in your mind.
Yeah.
And you go to the end of that street and it's like, oh, cool. This is where that person took their smoke break for the last month or 2 months. And the discards have remained there undisturbed because the landscape isn't valued. It's, blighted industrial landscape often. So there are all these ingredients that had to sort of come together for these little moments of accumulations where the scavenging was, the most productive.
It's very, it sounds very like primal, like you're kind of, sort of scanning for these super specific things. Like, if I see a red in the distance, I'm not gonna know one red from another, but it's almost like you're getting this very kind of like one of a kind skill set of like, I mean, is there another guy
that
on
isn't
Earth?
applicable to anything else?
Like the Terminator for finding discarded objects.
Hunter-gatherer, that's on my resume now.
Well, yeah, dude.
Take that to Indeed.com.
Yeah, but that Starbucks reference is funny too, because of course I started collecting Starbucks discards as well, and so that was also an evolution that from working with those industrial wood and metal, more object-oriented things. Once I transitioned to the Marlboro cigarette packaging, that directed me into a different part of the landscape. I didn't have to be solely in the industrial zones where those kinds of things would be found. The cigarette packaging was, distributed much more broadly through the city. And so that brought me out into the neighborhoods, and, it just expanded my collecting zone.
So,
and the subject expanded. I'm like, oh, I'm collecting things that are, now considered post-consumer packaging, wrappers, and ephemera. Well, that's a big subject now. Now it doesn't have to be cigarettes. It can be different brands of cigarettes, but it can be different items. Now it's lottery tickets, gum wrappers, plastic milk and juice caps, coffee cups,
Wow.
disposable lighters, and the list goes on and on.
So you're kind of basically following this feeling of finding new things in new places, and sort of throughout time, that's maybe changed what you do and how you do it. It's almost like, you're kind of being led in a way, right? You're being led to these new places and,
And
sort of
subjects.
Yeah.
And just the observational dimension to it.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciated and appreciate in so much as there's sort of a documentarian,
Yeah.
a documentary aspect to it, and also an archaeological, obviously anthropological too. I liked thinking of these items not only as literally what they are in the moment and as pigment for art, but as artifacts, cultural artifacts. So I was, able to sort of address a number of interests, from art making to sort of examining our present culture through these discards.
Well, yeah, it's like, some guy who goes to archaeology school, right? I mean, you spend you spend most of your time in the library, and you don't really you're not Indiana Jones, when you hear from people who, they want to study archaeology, they think they're going to be digging out the old pharaoh's tomb or whatever every day. And
Yeah.
it sounds like it's more, you're inside you're reading books and you're writing papers and stuff. But for you can go out there every day and go to a new dig site. You can kind of, everywhere you look is like there's a whole treasure trove.
You that's an interesting, I like the Indiana Jones and the archaeologist role to it. And it makes me think of sort of two very distinct processes in my art making. There was that I'm at the dig site, I'm out on the scavenge collecting materials. That was a very free and open time where I was open to receiving things. And then there's the more studious, disciplined processes that take place in the studio, where you have to sort of assess and study and assimilate and organize and make a statement with them. And they're pretty different mindsets in a way. I mean, it'd be nice to keep it as free roaming in the studio as you can on the scavenge, but they're different.
So what does your process look like from a totally, non-conceptual, like what is a normal work day for you in the studio look like? How does that start?
Well, depending on the tasks at hand, there's a lot of construction and building, I would say, as related to the panels that these materials go on. I often typically have been working with sort of a traditional artist canvas that I make custom. So there's a wood panel armature that I have to build and stretch canvas over, or linen. Then I size it with an acrylic medium. And then there's also the sorting process, which sort of bridges the scavenge and collecting the materials to the more rigorous organization that takes place in the art making. I have to separate and sort the bags that I have accumulated over maybe weeks or months before I do the sorting. Wow. And that's kind of making sense of the pigment, kind of, maybe you could liken it to grinding the raw pigments to make the paint that I will paint with.
Do you ever have a giant canvas with a ton of packs of cigarettes or partial packs laid out and that are not yet secured to the canvas?
Yeah, that's a good point, Harris. That has been my working mode. Is there's a significant amount of arranging that takes place while all the requisite parts are loose and unaffixed. So I can move them around, and develop the composition as if I am painting. One quality to that, which is daunting in a way, is that the finished piece is always in front of you. I'm not working, typically in the past, I haven't been working in a layered process. So all the visual information is there. I just have to put it together in a puzzle, where it all fits together. And then after, extended period of time of doing that, arranging and rearranging, trying to find the composition and the feel that is good.
So
then there's a process of gluing it to the canvas panel that I've made for that composition.
Have you ever bumped the canvas when it was before it was glued down?
Yeah. I've definitely bumped and nudged. I haven't had any catastrophic drops of that, but it definitely is sort of a concern. I'm imagining like an earthquake at the wrong time, because there's hundreds of hours sometimes just loosely set laying there that could be disturbed.
I was going to ask, like, how long are each segment of your process? So you have this initial collecting phase, you have a sorting phase, you have an arranging phase, and then you have this final, cementing it in. What does that look like time-wise?
It's hard to totally put parameters on it, because it's an ongoing process where you keep on adding to the reserves of the palette and the pigment. But a number of pieces, for a significant body of work that I did that I called Evidence, 2, 4, 6 years of collecting and then accumulating to get enough pigment of the particular items to get the scale and the expanse that I wanted to share, and that the materials themselves kind of encouraged me, because I was finding them in repetition and relative abundance. So that part of the phenomena was like, wow, I need to just convey that there's a lot of this, as a very elemental part of this discovery and observation.
And I think, so the viewers know, Evidence is a complete show with multiple canvases.
Correct. Yeah, it's a body of work that came to be essentially between, ultimately 1991, 92 to 2002. So let's just say it was a decade of work.
Wow.
That I devoted to one body of work. And that felt really great, because I stepped out of the mindset of making pieces to then take to market to sell. I kind of defied that and created this sort of sanctified space for the art, and also to run contrary to the consumerist nature of the very medium that I was working with. All of that is immediate gratification, quickly consumed and then discarded. And then I was countering that with timeful care, consideration, and what ended up being, for better or worse, a reverence for the materials.
So you're spending, if you're spending almost a decade on a collection or a work of art, which is, an incredible amount of time. Like, if you think about how much a person changes in a year, 2 years, a decade, and you've got this kind of brewing, gathering, perfecting, getting it ready.
Mm-hmm.
What is your like normal life look like? Like, how are you uh, living and existing in the world, in a world where, you gotta, you gotta put food on the table, you gotta make rent. And it's like, you're not able to sell that for a whole decade, like
Yeah.
in a very practical way. Like how do you make that work? Like, how do you make that happen?
Yeah, well, having a day job is what enabled me to sort of create that space where I took the pressure, I took the economic pressures off of my personal art. And I was, for a good chunk of that time, I was an assistant to a sculptor. And I was helping him make his sculptures and art. And it was a very different medium. I was carving granite and marble and also welding metal, stainless steel and bronze, and doing some more, maybe perhaps more traditional, timeless, ancient art processes. And so that's how I did it.
How does that like inform what you're doing with your own stuff? Because it's like, is that allowing you to kind of compartmentalize what you're doing, and sort of, are you getting inspired by your day job? Is it more of a, I need to escape my day job and make this better? Like, what's that interplay like there?
You know what I think you might have hit on that I never really recognized is that it gave me, my day job gave me the opportunity to make art in a more fluid manner, where I was getting to exercise, gesture of and movement of my body, carving these shapes and sculptures. So it nurtured and kept me more in the present. And whereas my collecting and accumulation process was so long and drawn out that, it would have been distressing, I guess, if that was my sole creative expression, until it got to, even though it was so rich and meaningful in the collecting process, there was a big absence of sort of the realization of the visual component of the art. So it probably helped sustain me while I needed to collect those materials.
So it's not even just like an economic sustenance, it's like a creative sustenance too, because you can every day go make something, you're doing it instead of sort of like stewing and brewing and waiting and sort of letting it. It's more immediate.
I think that was really beneficial then. And then when I sort of transitioned to selling my work and being self-employed, one thing that happened is I started making smaller pieces to make them more timely, in a timely fashion, and to make them more accessible. You had to like create different scales and price points to sort of make the economic model work.
You have to get kind of creative in a different way. It's like
creative in a different way, and also being able to access some of the reserves of the materials previously collected while continually replenishing them. And then at that point is where it's hard to go, well, how long did it take to make this piece? Well, some of these contrasts are the result of collecting materials in the mid 90s or the late 90s. And that might even be a hue or a pigment that is only available because of that era of dye and ink used on that particular item, that then changes as the factory formulas change, which added this whole other interesting dimension of following the lead of these found materials. They started to expand and restrict at times the palette that I had to work with, as that Marlboro red was no longer cadmium oil based. It became a water based, magenta based. So it looks like the same Marlboro red when you see it in its unfaded form, but instead of having that orange and yellow fading warm sunset color hues, it became cooler flesh tone and even magenta purple.
Yeah.
All of it together created this great palette. And so I was able to make some pieces that drew on that decade or two of pigment evolution.
It's like you're collaborating with the Marlboro guys, but they don't even know. You know, it's like the change they make. Some guy at the meeting is like, yeah, we should probably switch this out. Like, it'll be cheaper or whatever. And he has no idea. He doesn't, you know. You're
guerrilla collaboration.
Dude, yeah, that's really
Yeah,
crazy.
it is all about collaboration on so many levels, and obviously unwitting collaboration from most of the participants.
Yeah.
And it starts with the farmer growing the tobacco, and then every individual who's a part of that line of assembly and dissemination, to the bodega clerk selling the pack of cigarettes, but of course the packaging manufacturers and designers, those guys that are making the decisions about the ink and the package itself, and then the smokers. I mean, the part where it becomes very personal and intimate in a way, obviously, are all the smokers who have held the pack and toss it to the ground that I pick up.
Wow.
And that invisible anonymity, I felt was very poignant. It resonated with me.
Could you put a number on how many Marlboro packages you've picked up in your career?
I would just put it in the hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands. That's hundreds of thousands of people at, you know, countless minutes of their day. And then you have all of the, it's like you've got a whole room of people that don't even know they're in the room with you, like helping you make it. You know, that's like 30 people, right? If you add up all this stuff, all the farmers, the meeting, the marketing people, the smoker, like, it's really crazy.
Yeah. I like that idea. I shouldn't feel so alone in the studio.
Dude, you got a gajillion people in there, dog. Like,
yeah.
It's a bit like that movie with Jack Nicholson, The Shining.
Yeah.
Dude, yeah. Yeah, the hotel is alive. Dude, what is your hotel? Like, where do you keep this stuff? Where do you put it once you get it?
Well, I've in my art studio.
So is your studio full of like bags and bags of, wow.
It is. It is. And I've expanded my studio over the years from, a 550 square 100-foot footprint, of which I built, lots of lofts for storage and other purposes. Then I expanded that and added another 800 square feet to that. And presently I'm in a 1,200 square foot space with a 200 square foot mezzanine that is devoted to storing, a lot of processed scavenged materials. And then I have other storage racks that have bags of less processed materials. So it's like an archive that speaks to the landscape and our culture and my process in its less formalized artistic version. I mean, it's art in advance of itself in a way.
I mean, it's like it's you're kind of living in it, or you're amongst it. Just, you got to kind of unlock it and put it together. I mean, just looking at kind of your background now, I'm understand you have all these containers around you. Going back to Indiana Jones, it's like at the end of Indiana Jones, when they're in the warehouse with all the stuff.
Yeah,
that's dude, that's your thing, man. You're in the archives, and that's where you pull, except instead of like an ancient Egyptian cat or whatever, is in one of those crates, you have to assemble it. You're pulling the archives out and then creating the art after. That's really cool.
It's I mean, there's my original interest in the found object is that it contained information to respond to. In the beginning, it was a nice change, a reprieve from the blank canvas. And, I was working very abstractly as a painter then. So, it was about visual, optical effects and sort of just pure emotion as reflected through, the gesture of movement and essentially dance, I guess you'd say, if the canvas is big enough, which is definitely a reflection of your inner world.
Yeah.
And so it was fun to sort of add this dimension of exploring society and culture, and landscape in general, to get outside of the studio, to not be contained within that traditional artist's cell. It was like the whole world became my studio, and that in effect felt liberating.
Mm-hmm. I can see that being kind of exciting to be able to reflect your inner feelings with kind of this outside. And then it's like, when you're trying to think of something, it's like you're reacting instead of just trying to come up with that. It's like you're
not staring at a blank page.
You're just going. You can go right away and get after it.
Yeah. A really satisfying synthesis of internal, let's say, emotional landscape and the physical landscape that you're moving through. And the walking itself as an activity was really nurturing to movement and fluidity of thought and contemplation. So it kind of fostered this meditation and contemplation that sort of formed the spirit, if you will, of the whole investigation moving forward.
Wow.
And maybe you can get like a Whoop sponsorship or something, like some kind of exercise thing,
Yeah, that, or like Johnny Walker. I'll take multiple sponsors.
Yeah, man. Well, I'm wondering when people are going to start sponsoring artists,
Yeah, well, it happens. Absolute vodka. There's a lot of sponsorship there. And even Camel sort of integrated a lot of artists' input. I've noticed in some of their campaigns. It's interesting. I've always felt that, they were looking for something outside of the literalness of themselves. They were looking for aesthetic and cultural embellishment, and what I'm working with them. It might be a little too close to home in that there's obviously a lot of critique, I guess, that's implied.
Yeah.
With my work.
Because of the other companies?
Just, the controversial nature of, the effects of using their products, and then even that it's litter. So I'm showing that their consumers were throwing this stuff on the ground. And even though I, as an individual, am, kind of turning around that trajectory and turning it into a positive resting spot on the gallery or, home wall, there's just some darker connotations throughout.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
right.
That's what's kind of crazy about it, is that just by showing it, just by taking something and showing it in repetition and mass, there's like all this implied stuff, kind of what you're saying. There's these like darker subtexts about litter and addiction and stuff, but it's like, all you're doing is showing what they made, right? So but that just shows that what their advertising is their advertising doesn't want to have anything to do with the actual product. They want to be, like you said, as far away from it. Yours is the product, and that's what's like, no, like.
Yeah, they want some distractions, some stylistic element that enhances and changes the subject.
Yeah.
in part. And that sort of speaks to something I've sort of looked at and sort of pondered is, I've been working through the 80s and 90s when street art was really expanding, or at least being embraced by the contemporary art world in the galleries and museums, and not being solely on the walls of the city. But in that sort of approach, street art often appeared to me that the city and the urban landscape was a canvas on which to put art that naturally commented on urban experience and urban life. But my form of street art was the street becomes the subject.
The street is the art. Yeah.
The street is the art. It is the medium itself. And then I obviously, in the work that I've been doing, I took that subject and medium back out of I took it out of the street and into the art studio.
Wow.
And I would actually like to bring it. I mean, I think I would like to display it back again in the street where it came from. I mean, that seems like a natural sort of journey,
Dust to dust, dude. Yeah.
Completing a loop there.
Yeah.
And I guess the fragility of the pieces that I make and the inherent preciousness of them after all that time that has gone into the accumulation, collecting, and the assembly. It was a lot to give up, perhaps. I mean, maybe I could display them temporarily for a moment, but to return them entirely would have been a big step for me.
Yeah.
So you're describing a type of outdoor gallery.
Yeah.
And that brings up so I don't know if you're okay. I was curious if you're okay talking like price and what you've sold them for.
Yeah. The larger pieces that I've sold, have been between $10,000 and $20,000. And then smaller works, anything from $500 to $10,000, essentially.
So you can make a living in the arts.
You can. It's
All right.
possible. And of course, I've been, brushing up against the struggle of the duration of how long it takes to make the work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I sort of had to emerge from the sanctified space of keeping it separate.
Yeah.
And I was able to indulge in that pure art form, which, spoke to the subject of consumerism in itself. So, related to that challenge, the consuming habits have been changing and evolving, and tobacco use has gone way down. So
you got to get out there and start collecting jewels now. Yeah.
They're not discarded in the same way.
Yeah, I didn't think about that because vapes are reusable, right? A lot of them. So
yeah, you don't. There's not a trace evidence every 20 cigarettes, the equivalent of every 20 cigarettes puffed with a vape.
Yeah.
So there's the original packaging, then there's the refills, but it's just not as plentiful.
So you couldn't even make the art that you've made in the past today because the trash doesn't exist anymore. That's really interesting, man. That's like, it's sort of, they're all time capsules to, a time that will never exist again. Like that was that, and that's it. And
so,
wow.
From the beginning, I knew that the meaning of the work would change and evolve as our relationship to the materials and what they imply, what they contain. And I didn't really imagine or foresee how things would evolve. I didn't think of a world without cigarettes, but it's going in that direction. And so theoretically, it's of course, very interesting, but as someone who, found so much meaning and beauty in this somewhat ugly and destructive process and activity of smoking and discarding, I can't help but kind of wish that things hadn't changed. That's obviously very selfish, I guess. It's, obviously it's better if people aren't smoking cigarettes and throwing things on the ground. But simultaneously, another huge factor to this was the evolving, changing landscape with gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
So I was there in the industrial landscape and the surrounding neighborhoods at just a pivotal time. Like, it was a perfect time of decay and decline. It was ripe. Things were falling apart. Warehouses were empty, but enough were filled with manufacturing and assembly, other blue collar things, and the smoking or the anti-smoking campaign hadn't been as successful as it is now. So I was able to work with and comment on something that was very real and relevant on many levels and layers in our society. And then gentrification, as tech, .com, offshoring, outsourcing, automation, as those changed the workforce and simultaneously increased property values. I mean, it's been part of a mass migration and displacement, not to mention homelessness, which impacts the landscape in a different way. That is not as conducive to sort of the solitary walks that I was experiencing, that were much more conducive to daydreaming about this slow decline. Now the areas that that I had previously scavenged, they're lined with RVs, tents, people in boxes. I mean, it's entered now the dystopian realm, and there's really nothing left to romanticize.
Wow.
And that's painful on many levels.
Yeah. On that note, I would encourage all of our listeners to go out and start smoking to support your local artist. And do what you can for the local scene. Rob, before we go, is there anything that you want to plug, or is there anywhere people can go to check out your art?
Well, urbanexposure.com for sure.
Cool.
And you can look at Artsy.
Is that kind of like an Etsy to sell art kind of thing?
It is.
Okay.
It is. And for the most part, it goes through gallery affiliations. So it's not just individuals, but you can search artists by name, and then that will direct you to the galleries that represent those artists.
Okay.
And the work is available for sale.
Cool.
On that side.
Cool. All right. Yeah, well, thanks for joining us. This was really awesome. Feel like we definitely cracked into some new levels we've never gotten on this show before. So,
very cool. Well, likewise,
it.
You brought stuff out. I really appreciate the questions and the conversation, the dialogue. And
hell yeah,
Paris,
dude.
Thank you for thinking of me.
Oh, of course, man. Yeah.
Oh yeah, killed it. I think it's kind of like you said, man. It's like the real power of your art is that discussion that it brings out, right? And it's hard to go and meet there's no gallery openings going on right now, so just what we got.
Gotta use the tools that are at hand. But yeah, it's like the art is cool to look at, but in a way, it's more fun to talk about.